Some stories begin with turbulence, others with a look. But this one started with something quieter, a boarding pass, a name, and a pause that lasted just a little too long, long enough to shift the course of a day, maybe more. It was 2:07 p.m. when Aisha Robinson stepped onto Flight 482, bound for Atlanta, departing from Dallas. She wore navy leggings, a soft heather gray hoodie, and wireless headphones casually tucked around her neck. The kind of outfit chosen for comfort, for invisibility, for ease, practical, forgettable. At least, that was the idea. But Aisha had learned, in ways too numerous to count, that some things about her were never considered forgettable by others. Not in the way she might have wanted. Nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The cabin greeted her with the usual smell of recycled air and lukewarm coffee, the mechanical clicks of overhead bins slamming open and shut, echoing down the narrow aisle. The murmur of impatient passengers created a low, steady hum, a soundtrack of irritation and exhaustion that played quietly beneath the surface. Aisha shifted her backpack higher onto her shoulder and moved toward her assigned seat, 22B, weaving carefully through the crowd, avoiding brushing against knees and elbows. But as she approached her row, she paused, stepping politely aside to allow an older woman, short, hunched, and clearly struggling, to wrestle her overstuffed bag into the overhead bin. Aisha offered a small, patient smile, silently willing the woman success. It was in that simple act of patience that she first felt it. The shift. A tightening in the atmosphere, invisible but undeniable, prickling at the edges of her awareness, like a storm cloud gathering in a clear sky. She didn't look up, didn't react, but some part of her, the part that had been trained by years of similar moments, tensed instinctively, preparing for the subtle wrongness she could already feel blooming around her. The flight attendant approached, her uniform crisp, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight knot at the nape of her neck, every inch of her posture radiating authority and control. She moved with the detached precision of someone who had long since perfected the art of polite confrontation. She stepped directly into Aisha's path, her presence forming a quiet but unmistakable barrier. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice coated in a professional sweetness that felt like a thin veneer stretched too tightly over something brittle. Aisha blinked, caught off guard, instinctively stepping back half a pace. "I'm good, thanks," she said, offering the boarding pass that had been in her hand the whole time, lifting it with an almost reflexive motion. "Just heading to my seat." The attendant didn't reach for it right away. Instead, her gaze swept over Aisha with clinical efficiency, a slow, deliberate inventory. The hoodie, the leggings, the sneakers, the brown skin, the natural hair styled neatly into a puff. Aisha felt each glance land like a weight, like a silent question, like a silent answer. Finally, with an almost imperceptible sigh, the attendant reached out and took the boarding pass. She turned it over once, unnecessarily, her fingers brushing the paper in a motion that felt less like reading and more like inspecting. Aisha stood still, resisting the instinct to fidget, resisting the instinct to shrink. The moment stretched long enough that passengers behind them began shifting impatiently, stepping sideways to maneuver around the logjam forming in the aisle. Aisha could hear their faint mutters, feel their glances. To them, she was the holdup, the delay, the disruption. She could practically hear their thoughts. Why is she taking so long? What's the problem now? At last, with a too bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the attendant handed back the boarding pass and stepped aside. "Enjoy your flight," she said, the words dropping between them like a small stone tossed into deep water. The kind of politeness sharpened into a blade, thin and almost invisible but no less dangerous. Aisha nodded stiffly and moved forward without a word, her muscles taut with the effort of holding in all the things she wanted to say. She slid into seat 22B, the middle seat, of course, and stowed her backpack carefully under the seat in front of her. Her hands trembled slightly as she buckled her seatbelt, adjusting it mechanically, methodically. Around her, the plane filled with more passengers, a blur of voices, the rustle of jackets, the clink of carry-ons being stowed. But to Aisha, it all seemed distant, muffled, like she was hearing it from underwater. She sat stiffly, her shoulders tight, her breathing shallow as she stared at the tray table in front of her, forcing herself to stay calm. "It's just nerves," she told herself. "It's just flying. It's just one flight. Just one afternoon." But deep down she knew. She knew that the discomfort she felt wasn't just about planes or travel anxiety. It was about the gaze, the suspicion, the quickness with which people made her into a question mark instead of a person. This wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising, but that didn't make it any less exhausting, because no matter how quietly she moved, no matter how politely she spoke, no matter how neatly she dressed, there were still spaces, too many spaces, where she was seen not as a fellow passenger, but as something to be evaluated, doubted, contained. And today, it had started with nothing more than a boarding pass and a pause. The fight had already begun before the wheels had even left the ground. 15 minutes later, they were still at the gate. The hum of the overhead speakers occasionally interrupted the muted noise of shifting passengers and clinking seatbelts, but it was mostly a low buzz of discontent. Aisha felt the weight of the wait in every passing second. She was already on edge, bracing herself for whatever uncomfortable moment would follow. Then, the flight attendant's footsteps began to echo through the cabin, a steady rhythm that cut through the stillness. She moved with practiced mechanical efficiency, her every step purposeful as she made her way down the aisle. She was checking seatbelts, her movements precise, her face an emotionless mask, void of expression. Aisha adjusted her own seatbelt, knowing the drill, her body taut with anticipation. When the attendant reached her row, she paused, just a moment longer than Aisha had expected. There was a slight frown, one that seemed to appear on her face without any real thought behind it. A shift in her demeanor that didn't sit right. Aisha felt her stomach knot in response. "Miss, you need to buckle your seatbelt," the attendant said loudly, her voice carrying easily down the aisle, sharper than necessary, drawing the attention of the passengers ahead and behind them. Aisha felt the heat rush to her face, her cheeks flushing crimson as a sudden wave of embarrassment washed over her. Her pulse quickened, and she quickly tugged the belt taut, trying to keep her voice steady. "It is buckled," she muttered, barely above a whisper, desperate to keep control of herself, to maintain some sense of dignity. But the attendant didn't move on. She leaned in closer, and it felt like the air between them thickened, the gap narrowing until Aisha could feel the pressure of her gaze. It wasn't enough to simply check the seatbelt. No, the attendant seemed to be questioning her honesty. Her fingers brushed against the fabric of Aisha's seatbelt in a movement that felt unnecessary, deliberate in its invasion of space. Then, with a sharp tug, she confirmed that the seatbelt was indeed fastened. The sound of the buckle clicking into place was loud, almost deafening in the sudden silence, like the final judgment. Secure. The word lingered in the air as if it had been spoken aloud, its finality hanging heavy in the space between them. Aisha's chest tightened, the tension building to a point where she thought she might suffocate under it. An awkward silence followed, thick and suffocating, a weight that pressed down on her shoulders, a lingering discomfort that refused to dissipate. Her hands tightened into fists on her lap, her fingers digging into her palms as her body tensed, every muscle coiled and ready to snap. She couldn't look at the attendant, couldn't bring herself to meet the eyes of the woman who had just made her feel so small, so insignificant. She couldn't look at anyone. Her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythm frantic, the beat too fast, as if it would explode from her ribcage. The world seemed to narrow, the space around her becoming a blur of motion and noise, while she stayed rooted in place, forcing herself to remain still, to hold it together. The attendant stood up straight, her posture shifting with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The smile returned to her face, swift and practiced, as if it had never left. "Good," she chirped, the cheer in her voice so artificial now that it felt almost cruel. The sound was forced, hollow, a pitch she had clearly perfected, one that didn't match the look in her eyes. Without another word or glance in Aisha's direction, she moved on, continuing her march down the aisle, her steps mechanical, as if Aisha were already forgotten. Aisha's gaze remained locked on her hands, her fingers still digging into her palms, the pain a reminder to stay grounded. She focused on the burn behind her eyes, willing the tears not to fall, pushing the swell of frustration and hurt down into a tight knot in her chest. She could feel the weight of everything pressing against her ribs, a suffocating pressure she couldn't escape. She heard someone behind her mutter something, words too low for her to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. A quiet judgment, a subtle dismissal that cut deeper than any sharp words could. The sound of it echoed in her mind, louder than the voices around her. She didn't turn around, she didn't give them the satisfaction. An hour into the flight, somewhere over Mississippi, the cabin hummed with the low, steady buzz of boredom. Tray tables were down, some of them cluttered with half-eaten snacks or folded blankets. Crinkled snack wrappers littered the floor, left behind by passengers trying to occupy their time. The dim lighting cast everything in a washed-out glow, making the world feel softer, duller, more distant. Half-watched movies flickered faintly from seatbacks, their images distorted and blurry from the glare, the sound muted by the murmur of idle chatter. The air was thick with a restlessness that only long flights could bring, the kind that gnawed at the edges of patience, making the minutes stretch on and on. Aisha pulled out a book, hoping the familiar rhythm of the pages would help her lose herself, help her forget the discomfort of the past hour, the uncomfortable space of her seat, the weight of unseen eyes, the ache in her chest that she had yet to shake off. She didn't notice the soda can at first. It was just a little nudge, a tiny imbalance, like a fleeting moment of gravity acting in defiance. The can wobbled on its edge, teetering for just a fraction of a second. Then it tipped, and its fall became a slow-motion disaster. The stream of ginger ale splashed outward, the liquid spilling across the woman sitting in 22C. The woman, a white woman in her mid-50s, jerked back instinctively, her eyes wide with surprise as the soda dotted her sweater. Aisha's heart leaped into her throat, the sudden panic making her breath catch. She jumped up immediately, her hands reaching for napkins, grabbing a handful from the seatback pocket. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, her voice laced with genuine panic as she dabbed at the spill, trying to stop the liquid from spreading further. She could feel the eyes of the entire cabin on her, as if every pair of them were watching, waiting for her to do something wrong. But before she could finish, the woman recoiled even further, her body stiffening as she waved her hands in the air like she was trying to push Aisha away. "Just don't touch me," she snapped, her voice cutting through the tension of the cabin, sharp and harsh, like a whip cracking through the air. Aisha froze. The words stung, sharper than they should have been. They cut deeper than the spill ever could. Heads turned. A ripple of attention spread across the cabin, the quiet hum of chatter dying as the air grew thick with tension. It was as if a single word had been passed from mouth to ear, a signal that spread without a sound, without a gesture. The atmosphere shifted, the stillness suddenly charged with an electric hum. Aisha's pulse quickened, a rush of heat rising to her cheeks as she felt the weight of the unwanted attention pressing in on her. Her throat tightened, the lump of discomfort lodging in her chest. She felt exposed. She felt like she was under a microscope, every move analyzed, every breath judged. The flight attendant appeared almost instantly, her footsteps quick and purposeful, her eyes already narrowing as she zeroed in on the scene. Her movements were efficient, practiced. She approached like a heat-seeking missile, aimed directly at the growing tension. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice tight, the professionalism in it barely masking the suspicion creeping into her tone. The woman in 22C, clutching her sweater dramatically, looked up at the attendant with exaggerated outrage. Her eyes were wide, her voice cracking with exaggerated emotion. "She spilled her drink all over me, and then she was grabbing at me." She paused, making sure everyone around them could hear, her voice too loud, too insistent, as if she were trying to make the situation bigger than it really was. Aisha's mouth opened, her words tumbling over each other as she tried to explain, to make sense of the situation, but the attendant wasn't looking at her. She was already turning away, her attention already moving forward, her eyes narrowing as she spoke into her radio, her movements brisk and efficient. Aisha caught only fragments of the conversation, broken words floating back to her through the din of the cabin, distorted and distant. Disruptive passenger, a request supervisor upon landing. Panic clawed at her throat. Disruptive? The word echoed in her mind, sharp and jagged. It felt wrong. It felt like a punch to the gut. She had apologized. She had tried to help. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made a scene. She hadn't done anything wrong. But none of that seemed to matter, because in their eyes, she was already guilty. Her chest tightened as the words and the looks sank into her, settling heavy in the pit of her stomach. She could feel the weight of their judgment, cold and suffocating, wrapping around her like a shroud. Nothing she could say, nothing she could do, would change their minds. The truth didn't matter. The truth had never mattered. In their eyes, she was a disruption, a problem, a threat, not a person, not someone who was just trying to be decent, trying to make amends, just a headline waiting to happen. When the plane finally touched down in Atlanta, Aisha's heart hammered so hard in her chest that she could barely hear the captain's cheerful landing announcement, the voice barely breaking through the fog of tension in her head. The cabin erupted into movement as passengers stood and stretched, grabbing their bags, the air thick with the clatter of zippers and murmurs of idle chatter. The usual buzz of excitement for landing was muted for her, drowned out by the anticipation of what she knew was coming. But Aisha remained frozen in her seat, her body still, her mind racing, every second stretching long and taut, the ground beneath her feeling like it was tilting under her feet. She waited, counting the moments, feeling every second way heavier than the last. And then, 2 airport security officers boarded the plane. Their footsteps were deliberate, their presence measured, as if they were in no hurry. They didn't need to rush. The power was already theirs. An invisible force that carried in the way they stood, the way they scanned the cabin, the way the other passengers instinctively parted for them as if they were part of some unwritten law, some unspoken agreement that they were above the rest. Their eyes swept over the rows, landing on Aisha without a pause, and she could feel the weight of that gaze like a physical pressure. "Miss Robinson?" one of the officers asked, his voice neutral, neither kind nor harsh, but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority that made her stomach tighten. Aisha stood slowly, her legs shaking beneath her, each movement feeling slow and laborious, like wading through thick water. Every eye on the plane felt like it was burning into her, piercing her skin. She didn't need to look around to know they were watching. She could feel it in the way the air seemed to hum with the weight of the moment, judging, condemning. Not one voice raised in protest. Not one. Her chest tightened, her throat dry, as she followed the officers off the plane, her body stiff, her heart pounding in her ears. The walk down the jetway felt like 1,000 miles. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the faces of the other passengers now seemed like ghostly figures behind her, their eyes silent but heavy with judgment. Their words were unspoken, but the weight of them pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible shroud. They led her to a bland beige room off the jetway, the kind of room designed specifically to make you feel small, insignificant, like a mistake waiting to happen. The walls were bare, the lighting harsh, the air smelling faintly of antiseptic. It was a space that stripped away any semblance of comfort, any feeling of safety. There, in that sterile room, they questioned her, each question cold and methodical, as if they were reading from a script, trying to check off boxes, trying to make sure they didn't miss anything. Had she been drinking? Had she been aggressive? The questions came one after another, each one sharper than the last. Aisha answered each one clearly, steadily, her voice quiet but firm, fighting the tremors in her hands that she could barely control. Every word felt like it had to be measured, weighed, as if anything less than perfect would be used against her, like her very humanity was under scrutiny. The pressure in her chest grew with each question, each look from the officers that said they weren't satisfied, not by her calm answers, not by the facts of the situation. Despite her composure, despite the fact that she had done nothing wrong, they never once seemed satisfied. They poked, prodded, searching for something, anything that would give them a reason to continue. The air in the room grew thick with the weight of suspicion, and Aisha could feel it, like a blanket smothering her, making it hard to breathe. It felt like they were trying to break her, to force her into a shape that fit their narrative. Eventually, After what felt like an eternity, they let her go. No charges, no apology, no explanation. Just the cold, sterile echo of suspicion that clung to her like second skin. It was a weight that wouldn't leave her, a feeling that would linger long after she walked out of that room and out of the airport. She had been cleared, but nothing about it felt like justice. And deep down, she knew it wouldn't be the last time. The next time she stepped onto a plane, the next time she walked through a crowd, the next time she was forced to exist in a space where her very presence seemed to make others uncomfortable, it would be the same. The suspicion, the judgment, the weight of every eye that looked at her with distrust. She had learned that much, at least, that some people would always see her as a problem, and there was nothing she could do to change that. Aftermath. Hours later, back in her apartment, Aisha sat on her bed, her fingers absently scrolling through her social media feed, her mind wandering but never truly at ease. The silence of the room felt thick, almost suffocating, as though the air itself was pressing down on her from all sides, a constant weight that refused to let go. Each swipe of her finger felt mechanical, as if she were just going through the motions. The quiet was overwhelming, and she couldn't shake the sense of unease that clung to her skin. And then, a notification popped up, an airline statement. She had seen these before, the kind of generic, impersonal message companies release when things go wrong, when the details of a situation are carefully concealed under layers of corporate speak. Her eyes locked onto the words, "We take all allegations of disruptive behavior seriously and prioritize the safety of our passengers." No names, no specifics, just enough to smear her, to imply, without ever having to say exactly who they meant. Just enough to let the world fill in the blanks. Aisha's stomach twisted, a cold rush of anger flooding her veins. She could almost hear the subtle click of the statement settling into the public's mind, a vague shadow of an accusation that didn't need to be fully defined to be damaging. It didn't even matter that she wasn't mentioned by name. The damage was already done. The mere suggestion of something being disruptive was enough to stick to her, to create a stain she couldn't wash away. She closed the app with more force than she intended, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she stared at the ceiling, her mind spinning, her heart still racing. Outside, the city buzzed and pulsed with life. The world went on, indifferent, its constant hum of movement a stark contrast to the stillness that surrounded her. People walked, talked, lived, laughed. The rhythm of life continued, each moment moving forward, unfolding as though nothing had happened. The city didn't stop for her, didn't pause for the invisible weight she was carrying. But Aisha, she was stuck. She was frozen in the aftershock of something that wasn't her fault, something that had been thrust upon her, and yet she felt as though she were the one left to carry the consequences. The world continued to move on, but she remained, caught in the wreckage of what had happened on that plane. She thought about the woman's flinch, the way her body had recoiled at something as simple as a soda spill, the way she had acted as though Aisha was the one in the wrong. She thought about the flight attendant's assumption, the cold scrutiny in her eyes, the way she had watched Aisha with suspicion, as if her mere presence was something to be questioned, something to be feared. And then there were the officers, the cold, methodical questions they had asked, their detached, almost clinical tone, as if they already knew what she was before she had even spoken. And in that moment, Aisha realized something. It wasn't about the soda. It wasn't about the seatbelt. It wasn't about any of the trivial details that had been blown out of proportion. None of that was the point. It was about the simple, undeniable fact that no matter how quiet, how careful, how good she tried to be, there would always be people who saw something else. No matter how much she tried to fit into the expectations of others, no matter how much she tried to be what they wanted, there would always be someone who would look at her and see a threat, not a person, not a story, not a human being with a life, with a voice, with a history, just a headline waiting to happen. A flash of fear that didn't need a reason to exist. It was just there, planted deep inside, ready to grow, ready to take root in the minds of anyone who looked at her and didn't know her, didn't care to know her. Aisha let out a slow, steady breath, her chest rising and falling with the effort of it, trying to calm the storm raging inside her. She felt a fire deep within her, but not the kind of anger that burned uncontrollably. No, this was different. This was the kind of quiet resolve that settled deep into her bones, the kind of determination that refused to bend or break, no matter how heavy the weight pressed against her. She closed her eyes, letting the tension leave her body, if only for a moment, and she allowed herself a fleeting moment of peace. She would not disappear. She would not be erased. Tomorrow, she would fly again. Not because the world deserved her strength, not because the world owed her anything, but because she refused to let them take it from her. She refused to let them win. As Aisha sat there, her resolve solidified like steel, she knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The world wasn't kind to people who didn't fit the mold, who didn't look the way they were expected to. But she was tired of hiding, tired of shrinking to make space for others' comfort. She had fought too long to let her voice go silent, to let her story be drowned in the noise of the world. Tomorrow she would fly again, not for anyone else, but for herself, because she refused to let fear, judgment, or prejudice define who she was. And in that quiet defiance, she found her strength. This wasn't just her story. It was the story of countless others, people who had been wronged, misunderstood, and dismissed. But they too would rise. They too would refuse to disappear. If you resonated with Aisha's story, if you've ever felt like you were treated as a threat when all you wanted was to be seen for who you are, then subscribe for more. Stay connected, because this story is just one of many waiting to be told. Let's share our voices and our truths together.